hello, and welcome. Thank you for joining us in another Lawn Chair Philosophy Scholar Spotlight presentation. We are thrilled and honored to have Dr. J. Edward Hackett presenting The Neglect of Radical Empiricism and James's Critique of Metaphysics for Understanding His Will to Believe article. So Dr. Hackett, again, thank you so much for being here today. Please take the floor.
All right, so I also always present philosophy by preparation of a text. So, and this is, this talk is coming about, I'm writing a book. I'm about 60,000 words into a book on William James's philosophy of religion. So I've been, over the course of the last, I would say, year and a half, well, actually 2 years, right? On and off, I've been working on this monograph. And I've come across a lot of interesting characterizations of the will to believe argument. Everything from the historic James encounter of Peirce finding the argument just to be, oh my God, he's just off. You're allowed to believe whatever you want to believe. And many people do react to William James as offering us some sort of licensure for subjectivism. So for those of you who are joining us who are outside philosophy, the term subjectivism can be defined as that the approval or truth conditions of a belief are just because the subject wants to believe it, right? And that there's no rational or evidential or epistemic factors that feature into deciding whether or not a belief should be true. Now, when we take a look at William James's will to believe argument, when people do, it's the most highly anthologized article that James ever wrote. So when people read William James, it's often basically they read a will to believe, maybe. And if they read anything else, if they do read anything else, they read the first 1 or 2 lectures of pragmatism, right? If that. So what gets neglected usually in just terms of people's just everyday educated opinion about William James is that this essay and a little bit of pragmatism maybe, but mostly this, right? It's so my objections to the people who characterize James under a superficial engagement with his text, they're not actually engaging the later works that help to sort of smooth over the edges of a more appropriate James, because James moved to philosophy and metaphysics really towards the end of his life while also being a psychologist, right? So that these things should be all integrated in a more holistic and generous hermeneutic engagement with what James intends. But the most important thing to accept here, and I'm going to briefly engage with my text that I prepared for today, but people like David Lamberth and I do think that the notion of radical empiricism is given in the introduction to William, this book, published 1897, right? So it's William James, The Will to Believe and Other Essays in Popular Philosophy. And of course, this is a really beat up Dover edition that I use in teaching all the time. The point here, though, is that The Will to Believe came out 2 or 3 years before this is published, like I think 1895, and it's 1897. But don't get me, my years could be wrong. But the point is that it generated so much controversy that people really did, even in James's time, if they read James, they basically read that. So it's very much on the radar. But in the introduction to this work, James formulates the beginning of radical empiricism, right? So radical empiricism is in the backdrop at the very same time that the essay is published and then framed. So James is beginning to frame his argument with radical empiricism in the backdrop. So any engagement with the Will to Believe essay as it's framed from the book should take into consideration the actual framing that James was doing in composing the book with the introduction that he wrote, where he introduced the term radical empiricism for the first time, right? So, and part of radical empiricism is a series of metaphysics of experience that is emerging in the background of a critique of rationalistic philosophy, right? So even Peirce's pragmatism starts One of the first things, if we're in a pragmatism class, the first thing that I would do is I would always ground pragmatism as involved in the critique of certainty, right? That we get from Descartes. So all three, Peirce, James, and Dewey, are all reacting to the promise of certitude in these rationalistic systems, right? And James is no different. So let me elicit what that means and also what that means for the radical empiricism, right? So I want to pinpoint an example of a religiously motivated philosophy in Descartes with James's critique of rationalism. As Cartesianism is the most popular form of rationalism, it will serve as a frame of reference as to how James's notion of feeling and passional nature matter to maintaining religiously motivated commitments. By extension, James's critique of rationalism holds for any metaphysical system in philosophy of religion that thinks it has all the answers and, importantly, can access reality via the contemplation of it through reason, intuition, or something like Platonic nous, right? Nous is the Greek word for the faculty in the soul in Plato that accesses the forms. Rather, and according to James, the absolutist rational mind, quote, makes our universe by thinking it, end quote. Descartes is famous for positing that a self-reflective nature of consciousness has access to innate ideas through pure intellection. For Descartes, when pure intellection understands an idea, in a sense, it turns towards itself and looks at one of the ideas that are in it. In pure intellection, there are three metaphysical certainties in the Meditations on First Philosophy. That's the name of the book that Descartes wrote. First, there's the cogito, right? Next, there exists the certainty of mathematical objects and rationalism, and and finally, there exists God necessarily. For James, however, Descartes is a candidate for rationalism, and it's in opposition to rationalism that James inaugurates his famous pragmatism text. In that work, he writes, quote, "The history of philosophy is to a great extent that of a certain clash of human temperaments," end quote. In other words, philosophical systems are indicative of the temperaments that give rise to them, not the privileged access to that level of reality that would make it true. What might be the consequence of electing to see someone like Descartes' insights as their temperament? James describes the rationalist as, quote, "a devotee to abstract and eternal principles," end quote. Rationalists tend to see things as unified by emphasizing types of monism. Some may be idealists like Hegel on a whole, quote, "Rationalism starts from wholes and universals and makes much of the unity of things," end quote. As Descartes starts with the indubitable ground of a new foundation, and God unites the two substances together and maintains immanently the orders of the universe, the dualist picture fits starting with universal and attempting to deduce the whole picture of reality, even if not technically monistic, right? So Descartes is a dualist, right? Not a monist. Aptly described as tender-minded as opposed to the empiricists described as tough-minded, rationalists tend to be optimistic, thinkers more associated with inner feeling. More to the point, the rationalist, being religious as opposed to the empiricist, affirms vicious intellectualism, as James calls it. According to vicious intellectualism, James rejects the universe is accessed by concepts that mirror and copy its inherent static intelligibility. For any intellectualism then rejects that reality is known by brute sensation and filled only with objects of matter. Instead, reality is structured by eternal principles that must be true. For James, this is an escape. By being so dogmatic, the rationalist loses contact with the concrete parts of life. By losing contact with concrete parts of life, all rationalists are misconstruing how it is that experience truly works. Rationalism only offers, quote, "no explanation of our concrete universe. It is another thing altogether, a substitute for it, a remedy, a way of escape," end quote. For this reason, vicious intellectualism is always substituting some fixed idea when it should be looking at how a particular experience is undergone, right? James's pragmatism is a compromise against such rationalist dogmatism on the one hand that would prejudge the concrete world such that it could never be experienced, and a dogmatism that sees experience reduced to the simplistic account of sensations. Quote, "Pragmatism can remain religious like the rationalists, but at the same time, like the empiricisms, it can preserve the richest intimacy with facts," end quote. This is not to say that we should enter a world where no abstraction helps guide our lives. James wants a place for a middle view between the excesses of empiricism, which I do not have time to explain in this essay or this talk here, and the rationalist obsession with creating philosophy that trades personal, concrete, felt existence for something we never had access and only maintained because of how we felt, right? Instead, our experiences are discordant and unroll in time, to borrow an apt phrase from James. They come together, dissolve, and relate again to something else anew. In light of this discordance, felt and undergone within time, the failing grace of rationalism is to correct its incoherencies by the addition of trans-experiential agents of unification, quote, such as substances, intellectual categories, powers, or cells, end quote. In other words, the rationalists like Descartes or any classical theist philosopher of religion invents substances, powers, and construction of the self as a cogito to lay claim to something beyond experience that unites the otherwise truly discordant relations of experience together. The rationalist claims a form of privileged access that James's experiential scaffolding never proves existed. And the reason we're going here is this has been worked out, right? This is already worked out, between the 1870s all the way up in the 1890s. James is hearing Peirce, talk about certainty in Descartes, and all of them are in agreement. We must be empiricists, right? That said, that's with some qualification. What I don't develop here is also that Hume is an empiricist, but an empiricist that is so atomizes sensation that there is no coherence to his conception of experience, right? So pragmatism is a middle view between these. And pragmatism is developed and you don't actually have to accept James's radical empiricism, the metaphysics of experience that he thinks works with his pragmatism, but to get a view of James together, the pragmatism, which you might call the epistemology, right? And then the metaphysics of experience, radical empiricism, get joined together later on, right? Not at this time. But we are taking a backward look at trying to get the most out of WTB, Will to Believe, right? All right, so this section, I want to take a look at some relationship between pragmatism and theology. In the pragmatist text, I will show that James's critique of rationalist metaphysics sets the stage for his alternative, an empirically formed toleration of religion that turns on the inaccessibility we have of the divine. This parallels our lack of access to a reality beyond experience, even as philosophical theologians often assume such access, helping themselves to these beliefs based on the methodological tools of rationalism, whatever it may be, right? And so I don't say it here, but you can think of contemporary philosophers of religion, most famously like Richard Swinburne, who is, a substance dualist, right? But philosophers at Christian seminaries being dualists or idealists for that matter, right, are still helping themselves to commitments that seem out of whack with how we truly experience the world. So James's pragmatism about religious commitment makes sense only if James is right about the non-existence of a form of privileged access. Given that there's no privileged access to decide upon one of the multiple metaphysical systems of rationalism, then it holds that there are no means of privileged access to verify for all time various theological systems. In effect, all we have of them is but this, and this is James in pragmatism, that ideas which themselves are but parts of our experience become true just in so far as they help us get into satisfactory relation with other parts of our experience. So our ideas connect us to other parts of our experience and how these contents also coordinate with other people's experiences. Regarding truth, many think that James's conception of truth is a vice for allowing all manner of whatever one wants to believe to court. And that's never been the case for him, since there are two types of true ideas in James. There are the causes of where some fact is recorded as being the case to which our practices must conform and revolve around until they are changed and revised by better information. James's example 2 pages later concerns radium emitting radiation, which seems to violate the law of conservation of mass energy. So the ideas suggested by this experience require rearrangement of scientific theory, right? The causal structure of radium is mind independent and therefore establishes that the recording cases of truth operate a tergo. To say that something is operating a tergo, That Latin expression means that things are operating behind the scenes, but there are mind-independent scientific truths that you just can't ignore. Maria Curie lost her life, right? Investigating, I think maybe radium. I don't know what she was investigating, but I know that they didn't understand radiation, and she learned a very harsh lesson, right? Scientifically, anyone who didn't know about radiation at that time. And so we reaccommodate. So they're mind independent things that just are true of the empirical world. Another example, when I used to teach pragmatism, is if lava is flowing and we need to cross a street to evacuate, it becomes impossible for us to just cross. We need to find another way around the lava stream, right? We can't just go. That makes a definite practical difference to us, and that no sensible person who's interested in preserving their life would cross the lava stream, right? So, second, in those cases of faith and value to which our desire find satisfactory relation with other parts of experience, James has said prior to pragmatism, quote, the desire for a certain kind of truth brings about that special truth existence. For James, values and matters of faith constitute elements in the social world by the choice for humans to risk accepting and constituting the elements in the social world. I already read that sentence. I'm sorry. For James, values and matters of faith constitute elements in the social world by the choice for humans to risk accepting and constituting the world. Well, not exactly a religious example. James uses the example of how a collective choice and risk determine the possibility of a train being robbed. If the passengers of a hijacked train had more social solidarity, and highwaymen could not depend on a train of individuals who fear losing their life, then the highwaymen could not rob trains. The decision to create some possibilities and believe in them results in the highwaymen having an easier time of it. For James, quote, the question of having moral beliefs at all or not having them is decided by our will. The same is true of religious faith. Religion involves a faith in what he calls an unseen order. Even before James was asked to prepare the lectures that would become the Varieties religious experience, when he defined religion with the same phrase of an unseen order, he outlined the same commitment to this unseen order in Is Life Worth Living, 1895, also same book, right? So here's that passage. Religion has meant many things in human history, but when from now onward I use the word to use it as declaring that so-called order of nature which constitutes this world's experience is only a portion of the total universe, and that there stretches beyond this visible world an unseen order of which we now know nothing positive, but in its relation to which the true significance of our present mundane life consists. A man's religious faith, whatever more special items of doctrine it may involve, means for me essentially his faith in the existence of an unseen order of some kind in which riddles of the natural order may be found and explained. So in this passage, the will to affirm belief means that belief is attempting to solidify into a habit. Religious beliefs emerge out of the sentiment that stretches behind and encompasses the spaces between the gaps. For James, we have no access to the unseen order, but only the will to affirm it. Science can only know one portion of the total universe in nature. It is capable only of a partial vision of the whole. In being only a part, the unseen order is that which we know nothing positive. At best, the unseen order can be felt, but not known. Faith makes sense of the gap between the order of nature and the unseen order. What fills the gap is the desire for the truth that the gap not persist. Spiritual practices and religion fill that gap and thereby direct the channels of effective relations towards what we may hope and risk in religious belief. The gap persists even for theology as it does for the same critiques of rationalist metaphysics found in pragmatism. So it makes little sense to invent some new fashionable trick of reason to arrive at the necessity of what one chooses on feeling should be proven with reason. Consider the status of theological ideas comes only after the famous passage affirming that truths are instrumental and experience is malleable to human need. James writes, if theological ideas prove to have a value for concrete life, they will be true for pragmatism in the sense of being good for so much. For how much more they are true will depend entirely on their relations to other truths that also have to be acknowledged. Interesting. In this passage, James ties the risk of life to every other concrete part of experience. Part of his commitment to radical empiricism is that persons only experience particulars, then abstract ideas are shortcuts derived from particulars. Most trends of Abrahamic theology insist on privileged access to revealed truth, and yet James binds religion to the concretion of all relations to other parts of shared experience. Each part decided of a felt relation risks us equally into an uncertain future. In this way, there is an ethical limit that forbids an absolute subjectivism of prevailing as to what possibility religion and ethics commingling together can take, since there is a deep relational interbeing we possess in the experience of the world alongside others. The weight of our sociality becomes the field of these risks. Okay, that was the preliminary work. Now this next section is basically the sort of the heart of what I want to say, and then we'll go to a handout, and then if there's time, maybe we could take some questions. I have a lot of time still, right? Okay, so this next section is called How the Metaphysical Critique Sets Up the Will to Believe Argument. As early as the mid 1890s, James had been developing his radical empiricism that would become his metaphysics pure experience. The fact is that experience may only admit into its circle that which can be experienced. As a methodological principle, radical empiricism helped to explain early occurrences of the unseen order in his collection, The Will to Believe, and other popular essays. And the gap of the natural world to which James felt early on in Reflex, Action, and Theism, that the idea of God is generated by a teleological mind. As a teleological mechanism, the mind, quote, functions exclusively for the sake of ends that do not exist at all, excuse me, in the world of impressions we receive by way of our senses, but are set by our emotional and practical subjectivity altogether, end quote. Thus, it is out of the felt need, our affective ground, right, where these affective relations are, that our mind generates the idea of God or becomes aware. Regardless if generated fiction or something we become aware of, persons experience a relation towards that which is not immanent in experience, but exists on the fringe of our experience. In an even deeper sense, the felt demand and the need of life to coordinate the nature of reality with the unseen order is a reason for the will to risk life with that genuine option in mind. The teleological mind becomes that which sets ends for the purposes of the world we know not but inhabit with our senses. The want for theoretical certainty in Descartes, or Leibniz for that matter, is to posit that ideas transcend the fact of this gap. Empiricists like James, Ralph Barton Perry remind us, quote, broaden the area of knowledge and rely less on faith, but still fall short of those rationalists who claim to prove all things. This gap reflects the uncertainty of how experience is situated. All I can do is risk belief in theological commitments. Deep down, I cannot know beyond the gap of what I will to believe in either metaphysics or theology, right? I can know the consequences, but I cannot know those beliefs for sure because I have no access for verification, right? And for James, the verification is in the very experience of those ideas, right? So for this reason, we can understand why many scholars extricating the argument from his will to believe do not pay attention to James's echoing of the rational critique as his entire interrogation of Western metaphysics in that work. James's anti-metaphysical stance turns on the gap and the fact that the history of Western metaphysics has never agreed upon a complete test to verify metaphysical claims, and with so many examples of metaphysical theses over 2,400 years of Western thought, all metaphysics becomes powerless in the same way that theology cannot also help itself to the same ineffectual metaphysical methods. This is the passage that is often ignored in the will to believe. Let me read what I think people need to understand. There's two parts. This is the first part. No concrete test of what is really true has ever been agreed upon. Some make the criterion external to the moment of perception, putting it either in revelation, the consensus gentium, the consent of people, right? The agreement of people, the instincts of the heart, or the systematized experience of the race. Others make the perceptive moment its own test. Descartes, for instance, with his clear and distinct ideas, guaranteed the veracity of God. Reid with his common sense, and Kant with his forms of synthetic judgment a priori. The inconceivability of the opposite, the capacity to verify by sense, the possession of complete organic unity of self-relation, end quote. In this passage, we might even add our own day and age with logical positivism's avoidance of metaphysics being itself a form of metaphysics, Husserl's phenomenological method that guarantees a world of meaning at the expense of its materiality, right? I believe with Ricoeur, it does go to idealism. Marion's enshrining of phenomenological method to act identical to religious revelation, newly developed Thomistic systems, and any work in rationalist metaphysics that persists in analytic theology, like various forms of dualism. In these various systems, if I may venture to call them systems, there is no access to reality they claim to prove. These beliefs are maintained because the felt need of our mind generates the purposes to which then speculates and wills the generativity of meaning in the intersubjectively saturated social world to which all action must take place. The felt need to believe these commitments, despite the fact that they cannot be verified by some epistemic access, is then the proper starting place for both metaphysics and theology, and therefore understanding James's will to believe essay. All right. So the Jamesian avoidance of representative metaphysics is not only about methods in the will to believe. If the methods are incapable of accessing reality beyond philosophy, beyond experience and metaphysics and theological study that borrows from those same methods in philosophy, then we ought to avoid the pretense of certainty in any philosophical system, right? So pragmatism is also a deflationary critique and stance about what metaphysics can do. Right. So one of the things that you might not like about pragmatism is just how much it ties the hands of philosophy for quests of certainty. Right. Just after the previous passage I just read to you from the Will to Believe, James also writes this. Here's the second part that I think people need to pay attention to. Practically, one's conviction that the evidence one goes by is of real objective brand is only one more subjective opinion added to the lot. So there really is no objective certainty in metaphysics. It's just people subjectively assert that, right? For what a contradictory array of opinions have objective evidence and absolute certitude have been claimed. The world is rational through and through. Its existence is an ultimate brute fact. There is a personal God. A personal God is inconceivable. There is an extramental physical world immediately known. The mind can only know its own ideas. A moral imperative exists. Obligation is only the resultant of desires. A permanent spiritual principle is in everyone. There are only shifting states of mind. There is endless chain of causes. There is an absolute first, an eternal necessity, a freedom, a purpose, no purpose, a primal one, a primal many, a universal continuity, an essential discontinuity in things, an infinity, no infinity. There is this, there is that. There is indeed nothing which someone has not thought absolutely true while his neighbor deemed it absolutely false, and not an absolutist among them may all the time be essential, and that the intellect, even with truth directly in its grasp, may have no infallible signal for knowing whether it be truth or no. So in these examples, the theses of classical metaphysics are as endlessly varied, and all of them claimed to be certain. While endlessly certain and some in contradiction with one another, James has likely wound up in a similar position as Kant when he articulated that metaphysics is inevitably results in antinomies. In this way, we can end on an argument that serves as the background conditions for the will to believe argument that go completely unnoticed in the literature, right? So most analytic philosophers that engage the will to believe interpret it through the central grounding of epistemology, when in fact the entire argument in the will to believe is by contrast set up early mid-1890s embrace of radical empiricism and James's critique of metaphysics that seems likely even as far back as his Sentiments of Rationality, 1878, right? As David Lambarth has stated, James's definitive move to radically empiricist worldview is made by the end of 1895. Let me then propose a way to understand that foregrounds the will to believe when properly considered. I call this James's argument from the anti-metaphysics and radical empiricism. Kelly, can you put up the handout?
Yes, yes, yes. Here, let me pull that up. Sure, that's great.
And then towards the end of so keep scrolling down, you'll see something called William James's argument from anti-metaphysics, and so go all the way down, and I'll also go back up. But yeah, it's coming up right here. Yeah, that's it right there. So this is the William James's argument from anti-metaphysics and radical empiricism. And I wanted this on the screen for you to see, so before I'm reading these. So I'm going to read the premises and then read you know, my last bit here. And then I'm going to talk about how we conceptualize things with the earlier part of the handout. Okay, so so premise one: if P has no methods to verify a metaphysical proposition or set of metaphysical propositions that make up a philosophical or theological system, I just picked letters Q1 to Qn, right, the set of them, then P has no direct and privileged access to the unseen order. If P has no direct and privileged access to the unseen order, then P, being a person, cannot know in any sense what the unseen order contains via privileged access. So intermediate conclusion in premise 3, right, from hypothetical syllogism: if P has no methods to verify a metaphysical proposition or set of metaphysical propositions that make up a philosophical or theological system, Q1 to Qn, then that person cannot know in any sense what the unseen order contains via privileged access, right? Again, using 3 again as a premise, right, for 3-4 to end in hypothetical syllogism. So 4, if P cannot know in any sense what the unseen order contains via privileged access, then P can only will to believe some genuine option X and test the consequences of believing X. So 5, therefore, if a person P has no methods to verify a metaphysical proposition or set of metaphysical that make up a philosophical theological system, then P can only will to believe some genuine option X and test the consequences of believing X. So this is what I'm, trying to formulate. And if we take into consideration all the limits of experience and the limits of what James is doing, because he's also, the thing that gets missed in the will to believe is the actual critique of classical metaphysics that is setting up. Can you scroll up to the Clifford's evidential principle at the very beginning? Thank you. So if we see here, right here, strong evidentialism, right? It is wrong always and everywhere for everyone to believe anything on insufficient evidence. Regardless of Clifford never really spelling out what an adequate criterion for sufficient evidence is, I'm going to leave that aside, right? And actually, even though I don't like Aiken's book on the will to believe argument, I do believe that when he gives the principle of IER, which he calls integrated evidential something or other, IER, he calls it IER, that his version is better than Clifford's strong evidentialism, right? It becomes integrated along for experience. I don't really think that Aiken gives a fair shake to James, and is one of the principal dialectical partners that I think that my talk is directed against, even though it's not here explicit, right? But, if you want to take a look at that book, Bloomsbury 2018, forget the title. But anyway, so in the above argument, right, that argument I just read to you, but this strong evidentialism claim, if we took a look at the fideistic reconstruction of the will to believe right here, if a person P has a choice of whether to believe in X, and we take a look at A, B, C, and D, the truth of X can neither be proved nor disproved, right? The consequence of A is not believing in evidentialism, or thinking, to put it, I think, in a Jamesian point, James thinks that's too much. He's not necessarily against having evidence for beliefs, especially for recording cases of truth, right? But he's also admitting, even as far back as the sentiments of rationality, that our aesthetic and practical demands of life are also constitutive of reasons for belief, and that it's not all the way down evidential considerations for religious belief, right? Religious beliefs and also genuine options. So this is what I call the fideistic reconstruction of, in this way, many people think of the will to James, will to believe argument as equal to Pascal wager, right? So Pascal's wager basically says in a four matrices, right, what would be the benefits of believing in Christianity, belief or no belief, and then those beliefs actually being true, whether those beliefs are false, right? and you still get the net benefit that you would, even if they weren't true, you would still be a morally virtuous person. So there is payoff for accepting Christianity. Now, Pascal's wager is about belief payoff. And here, the reason why A is maintained, even in the fideistic reconstruction, is that the truth of X can neither be proved nor disproved is a consequence of the metaphysical critique of classical metaphysics. It's not all the way down simply because Clifford is the interlocutor that sort of motivates also these considerations, right? But Clifford's strong evidentialism, right, is read and appropriated by my analytic colleagues because analytic philosophy developed from the standpoint of never abandoning the epistemic subject as the primitive basic subject of all. That's the standpoint from which most of analytic philosophy is written. It privileges the centering of epistemology, but not the existential demands of finite life that are placed upon people, right? So B, the choice is living, relevant, specific, existentially relevant to your own context, right? Or the choice is momentous, it's very important to us. Or the choice is forced. To delay in making a choice is to lose out on the benefits of making a positive choice. So the idea here is that you're stuck in this sort of space where if the goods of Christianity are true, if you could, like, you know, gain the benefits of an afterlife or whatever they might be from your religious tradition, whatever those benefits are, if you are permanently stuck in an ability where there's a gap, you don't have access. But that thought that there is no gap, that it's somehow about doxatic states and that this is an epistemological argument or it's a metaphysical argument, right? So if we scroll down, people then basically take this fideistic argument and then they substitute belief in God. And then after all these premises, which, you know, this is a modus ponens, right? If A through D, a person makes the choice to believe in God, therefore, absent evidence, God exists. But this construal, which, you know, I think of this as, you know, people think of the will to believe argument as a proof for God's existence, not the actual conditions under which we might have to assert our belief, even though we're in this position where we can't know. So I think that it's better to go down here. So if you scroll, yeah, thank you. So the faithful Jamesian reconstruction of the will to believe essay, right? I would say whenever we have a choice of whether to believe X, the truth of X can neither be proved nor disproved. The choice is living, the choice is momentous, the choice is forced. Belief in God amongst other religious commitments belief, at least for some person, satisfies A through D. Therefore, at least for some person, it is rational to decide to believe in God. Now, there's a difference between this and that one up there. Absent evidence, God exists, right? The will to believe argument is taken as becoming almost so similar that whenever I see it reconstructed by some analytic thinkers, right, that it immediately becomes about God's existence. It's not about the extra rational circumstances under which we existentially find ourselves. But if you're sensitive to pragmatism and phenomenology, I think something like my reconstruction down here becomes about the actual lived experience and the dimensions under which we actually entertain religious hypotheses, right? Or that we're not, you know, we don't want to get rid of them. So you could see I actually put belief in God amongst other religious commitments and beliefs, right? So if, for instance, undergoing that Sundance ritual, and if I'm a member of the Lakota Nation, if that will fulfill A through D, and we're not actually in a position to know whether, you know, Wunkantanka is a being or not, or we're not in a position to verify Jesus's incarnation as the actual God versus, you know, my Muslim brothers and sisters who don't think that Jesus was God, right? I mean, we've spilt lots of ink over thinking of these as literal truths that are about the state of affairs in the world, but we were never ever in the actual existential condition to verify one or the other, right? So Jamesian pragmatism constrains us And the implication of that pragmatism does become radical empiricism. And then we have these effective relations with the universe. We can't verify them. At best, maybe we get some glimpse at them in mystical consciousness or in other psychological states that might be able to, we might think, penetrate the unseen order. But even then, even then, when we get out of it, we lose the awareness of those contents. So even if you think that mysticism is licensed by James, that gives some sort of access to the divine, it still remains an unseen order. The gap still persists. And we still are trapped by the empirical constraints that generate knowledge. But I don't think that we should ever abandon the empirical constraints, because those are just the constraints under which experience is undergone. So if we start grounding, so let me just finish out this right here, but I wanted to sort of consult this, and Kelly, you could make this available if you want to anyone who then, when you record the talk, right? So in the above argument, when I'm talking about the William James's argument from anti-metaphysics and radical empiricism, in the above argument, let me define how I'm using the phrase philosophical or theological system. By system, I mean a unity of propositions that cohere together and express this coherence as a unity. These propositions are characterized by their intent to express a synoptic vision that encompasses reality, right? So premise one affirms the condition in which James articulated his pragmatism and his radical empiricism. Given that there are so many methods to verify in metaphysics, any person P doing metaphysics is stuck in the position of overdetermination by any one of the various methods, each claiming access to mirroring what's truly real, whatever that might mean. Premise two fares as equally well as the gap in Kant between what is truly is and what we cannot in principle represent. For this reason, we can then generalize to any philosophical or theological system, and by system we mean a coherent set of propositions about reality or God. Given premise one and two, the hypothetical syllogism completes premise three. Premise three is doing a lot of the bulk of the work for James and me. Given that many systems of philosophy and theology in which depend upon philosophical systemization of views, rationalism will always seem empty. For this reason, James can introduce the question, what are we doing when we claim to know a philosophical answer about reality when it's clear there's no privileged access to know a philosophical answer? The answer is that we are maintaining and affirming this belief because the felt need to do so. Part of our social reality, and indeed our social world, is in the process of being made by all our participating wills. Answering such questions then is the matter of the will, as the will is what can offer up a solution to the felt need experience generates when it encounters suffering and uncertainty. When we acknowledge that fact, that we are in a position to understand charitably James's overall will to believe argument, it is not, as it would seem, about doxatic states or direct challenge to Clifford's evidentialism. Clifford's evidentialism paints human knowing as an all-encapsulating experience, when for James and the radical empiricist, it is but one possible unfolding relation we maintain in the world. Such thinking tends to over-intellectualize epistemic experience at the expense of other forms of experience. In other words, strictly epistemic attention to beliefs and propositions confines the site of philosophical energy, not to the felt needs of a broader conception of philosophy, but to a narrow focus that eclipses the effective dimension of experience for a narrow rational one. By eclipsing affectivity, the bias in philosophy has been to see the role of our emotions as that which takes us away from the rational power of the soul, and yet, as James has shown brilliantly, our affectivity is what undergirds our rationality, right? And anyway, there's a footnote to the sentiments of rationality, which is another essay I should probably give a talk on, because it's very beautiful. In the above argument, the term unseen order refers to how James refers to that which was religion's about. I preserve the term genuine option for these types of beliefs that James analyzed in the Will to Believe essay. But for now, let's just call them religious commitments. Whatever the unseen order is, if it exists at all, is best decided on the grounds of believer P, insofar as those grounds are agreeable in relation to others. For this reason, the implication is that, like Kant, there's no specific answer to what reality is. There is no method we can verify to arrive at a specific answer. If this is true, then no religious or metaphysical system can carry the day against all others. Thus, we are left with a de facto pluralism because of our dearth of accessing reality includes all the ways it can be experienced. By pluralism, James means that the content of experience cannot be reduced to one type of trans-experiential agent of unification, which is, his phrase. One implication might be of this argument that analytic theology and analytic philosophy of religion that are thoroughly dedicated to God's existence are an impossibility if they depend on some claim or concepts mirroring eternal reality beyond experience, right? Instead, religion is one of those ways we cope with a fragile and vulnerable existence. And when we confront our fragility and vulnerability, our concepts anticipate how we might fare and act when these concepts are called upon to play a role in making sense of our universe, especially in light of our suffering. In other words, our concepts acquire intelligibility after subsequent application due to the effective need of our relation with the larger cosmos generates. Reflecting this vulnerability, our wholehearted endorsement of willing to believe a religious commitment or set of those commitments means facilitating our option with the materiality of human suffering and strife. These realities are shared within the social field because they are felt in the very effective ground of our own becoming. We have no access to verify these religious commitments. I can readily test the consequences of holding onto a religious or spiritual practice in the shared cultural space alongside others we call the world. The manner in which these concepts become in the possibilities of action they illuminate is where and how they become intelligible in the first place. In this sense, religion is a meaning-making activity that props up, sustains, and renews meaning of our shared intersubjective world. This meaning-making manifests the moment of our application of a concept, guides religious action, and so thereby constitutes it. So that's the end of that paper. And when you make the actual passage from The Will to Believe that gets ignored is also in the very end of that handout, right, with an excerpt from this paper. So that's what I have to say, just very briefly about The Will to Believe. Hopefully I've been concise and clear. If not, please, I open the floor for anyone who may wish to ask questions regarding what I've said. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes, let me extend that. We have a couple of attendees. You may raise your hand over there in the back if you have a question, or Frank, if you have something to contribute.
Very interesting. A lot of food for thought. Some of this stuff's rusty. It's been since the late 70s that I heard some of those terms. So it's I was fascinated by a couple things. Your use of the term gap. Obviously, where I want to go and think some more about that is how that applies to the whole God of the gaps phenomenon that Freud was sort of famous for. Where did you find that? If I want to go explore that a little bit more, was that a term that James actually used, or is that your term?
That was me trying to make sense of in the book. Is life worth living? Right? There's a gap between what we know of the natural order and the unseen order. So the introduction of the word gap was me, right? I
laud you for that because it's the perfect term. I sort of smell what you're getting at there, but I need to think about it a whole lot harder.
Yeah, the God of the gaps. If I recall correctly, I mean, there was a collection that was it Richard T. Pennock? There was like Evolution and Intelligent Design. It was a yellow book. Some years ago, I forget the title, had a series of essays in it. But God of the Gaps became a problem for the theist, if I recall correctly, right? Where, science takes over some explanation of a certain section of reality, and then there's stuff that we don't know. So the theist posits God of the gaps, but like it becomes an abusive kind of thing. You're using God to sort of solve. But the naturalist is looking at you like, why do you need God? And God is just a God of the gaps for you at this point, right? So it's kind of like a philosophical challenge from the naturalist to the theist at that particular point.
Yes.
Right.
But you take it, your use of the term is much more interesting, which is,
yeah,
if I'm following you, basically there's always going to be gaps. There's no gaps to be
right. But the gap is because, I mean, you know, I also see a lot of when I talk to friends who are interested in like Christian existentialism, the reason they're reading Kierkegaard is the same reason I'm reading James. It's that, you know, Kierkegaard is just starts to affirm Christianity on the existential leap because there is the gap, right? It becomes the leap of the absurd. But I find Kierkegaardians to be the most honest about the actual starting place where all Christians, I think, should be, right? I think all Christians should be Christian existentialists, but I don't really think that you could I don't think you could defend any religion the way that people want to defend religion as people want to defend science. It's just there's this very interesting historical reality that we've faced in the West where the development of the Enlightenment historically was entrenched alongside what had developed with Christianity. So Christianity seems to be the one religion that always seems to like try to prove itself with apologetics because it was so historically in competition during the Enlightenment, right? So, I mean, I don't necessarily know. I mean, I'm not aware of other religions that try so hard. Now, of course, you know, this could just be my position in the West, right? And in a very Christianized United States, right? So.
I don't want to dominate the discussion. So
no. I mean, philosophy is a dialogical encounter along three axes. It's me and the text, me and other people, and I and myself, right? So.
No, I had lots of things to think about here. I appreciate it at the end, and again, I'm going to go back and watch the recording to capture it. In my psych of religion class, we get into Clifford's agnostic veto, and your twist on that in the end was a little bit different. And when I say different, what I liked about it is I think mine's this sort of more simple-minded, shaking the fist at the medical materialists, and you sort of lay out there more clearly his emphasis on the feeling piece of that. Well, let's use that as the lead off foot here. It's almost that he's not disagreeing with Clifford. He's simply saying that's beside the point. That's not really the name of the game here. So
there are times where, you know, the objective world only gives you a few options for belief, right? So I was aware, one of my professors back in my master's program, he gave us stories of like when he was in his 20s and like the 70s, he was like climbing mountains in Yosemite, right? And somewhere along the line in the last 50 years, climbers have climbed some things in parks that they would hammer in these, you know, their I don't know what they're called, the stakes or whatever.
An anchor,
when they anchor themselves into the mountain. But because people were traversing those same paths, some of the rock shale is no longer able to hold people, and so the more people participate and climb. So now that if you're going to you can do free climbing in certain sections, but there are rules for the preservation of the park and the rock faces, right? Where there is some restriction now as to where you can climb and where you can't climb, all based on the amount of people going to do it. So, you know, I often say, like, you know, there's only a few paths to Mount Everest that prove passable, right? And there's a variety of people who do it. And you would be irrational if you ignored the objective features of the world to formulate a belief about which path gets you to the top of Mount Everest or to whatever rock face you're climbing, right? And if other people have ruined the path, right? So when you hike in the woods, one of the principles that you learn in a backpacking class that I took is to take the shortest path on the path, because if people keep going around a puddle, they're gonna ruin the path and they're gonna ruin vegetation on the side. And if so preserve the conditions under which, you know, you can preserve it for most people.
That metaphor, that's good. Yeah, good.
Because, like, you know, there was this interesting, I'm talking about paths, and this is kind of a tangent, but there was this deer path that all the students took on the quad at Slippery Rock when I was there, and they would go across to the library from basically Spot's World Culture Building, and it was this path that was just there. And now there's actually a sidewalk. I went there, like, you know, I've been gone like 20 something years. I go back and take pictures of the quad, and now there's a sidewalk on the deer path that was invented in the quad. Whereas at Grove City, right, you can't walk on the grass at all. So,
Right.
but I mean, I'm kind of getting away from James at this point.
Yeah, no, well, indirect approaches to James' work too. So that's, I'm curious if you've looked into any of the CRSR stuff in your exploits. I'm just sort of scratching the cognitive science of religion, some of the, what's the fellow's name? Justin Barrett in crowd?
I have not.
Okay.
Some years ago in graduate school, I got a hold of some of these people that were doing like fMRI imaging of people who are meditating, right? And I thought, like, could you finish out? Because when you finish the varieties of religious experience, you feel like you've just walked into the world of someone who invented psychology of religion, but you feel like the door never really reached any predictive results of what that possibly could be. So you're wondering, you know, when you read, you're wondering, like, where can you go with this? One of the best works in religion that I've read, I forget her name. She was a psychological anthropologist, and she went, and I own the book, it's on the bookshelf out there. But she was just talking to people in evangelical churches about how they talk to God. I forget her name. I could actually Google it, right? Was it Lerman or something like that? I actually thought that when I read that book, I was like, wow, this is like Varieties of Religious Experience just done by, you know, a psychological anthropologist. But she did like ethnography by going to all these sort of churches and you know, immersing and telling the experiences of how people think they talk to God, right? And then she recorded their testimonies of subjective experience, and it was like a 21st century version of something I was already intimately aware of. So,
and hopefully more concise than James was.
Yes,
I love his book, but it takes forever. No, I'd be curious to know. I'd be curious if you can find it or pass it on to Kelly, because that's I've used the Varieties over the years, and it is great, but to try to convince undergraduates that it's worth reading is virtually impossible, because there's the description of the Varieties is simply so dense. And he claims up front that he's not going to try to draw any conclusions, although he obviously does. But
it is Lerman.
Lerman, Lerman.
No, it's Tonya Lerman. It's Luhrmann.
Got it. Okay. To take a look. Thank you.
Let me go to see. Okay. When God Talks Back.
Oh, wow.
And when was this published? 2012 sometime. Yeah.
Recent enough. Good.
And she did some wonderful like ethnographic work.
Good.
And you know, not to say that, like, you know, I'm well past being an orthodox person with religious belief. But I also think that this sort of empirical approach to talking about religious commitments and paying attention to lived experience is a central feature of a certain orientation, because just as a human being who's been on this planet 42 years, I don't think religion's going anywhere anytime soon. So this idea that somehow there would be an enlightenment and that there would be scientific progress and that these beliefs would somehow fade away, they never have, you know. And in fact, I think they're going to become more. I've only seen the first episode of Raised by Wolves.
Raised by Wolves, no.
No, it's an HBO Max, and it's Ridley Scott directed it, and it's basically an android raising human beings on a new world, and we totally destroy this one, but and then there's a group like that basically have their own religion. It's not Christianity, but the android is as fundamentalistly dedicated to secularism. She's almost like it's almost like the French laïcité, right? It's like militant secularism, and then the people that the other ship lands in the beginning episode. I won't ruin it for you, but they got on like these knight cleric uniforms off the spaceship. So there's it seems to be like they seem to be similarly dressed like Knights Templar. It's really weird. And
not by accident, I'm sure.
But it's an interesting opening in the sense that like people who are militantly secular who close off the possibilities or the aesthetic engagements with existence are just as dogmatic, if not like the religious fundamentalist who closes off. So some degree of pluralism just seems to be the existential condition under which we find ourselves. So embracing that condition, it seems to be a wiser move for me, just thinking about human life in general, right?
Yeah.
And so James is a jumping off or starting off point for that type of conversation. Because, I mean, don't get me wrong, I there are some things that I'm not a Jamesian about, right? I'm not a Jamesian about climate change. I think that, I live in Louisiana, right? There are some estimates that like we'll lose thousands and thousands of square miles of where people live, right? And so if you're dedicated to like, living in the southeast corner of the boot in Louisiana, and even our Republicans down here on the state local level, they take it seriously too.
Sure.
They take it seriously insofar as people's rich houses might be washed over with water by 2050 or something, but they at least they give lip service to it, right?
There are some genuine options showing up there.
Yeah,
we do some of this right now.
But I do think as the world reaches towards calamity, overpopulation, and things, that people might just double down on old orthodox ways of understanding the world. I just, I think that's happening, if it's not happening already.
I think that example itself brings up an interesting avenue to explore. Something I have questions about is I watched a video. I don't even remember who in prep for this talk today. I've been so busy. I'm sorry that my preparation was watching a video. But the speaker spoke on living hypotheses and dead hypotheses, and I wonder if folks who might take a more, if they might retreat from this very living hypothesis of climate change and the need to do something progressive or wild or uncomfortable, this retreat into a more traditional sphere is a way of limiting those possibilities, because just that realm of that existential condition that you spoke of this pluralism, is just too much for folks to handle.
Yeah, that comment sounds like the sort of the French feminism seminar I was in, where the professor, she said, like, in some ways you can embrace otherness, but certain forms of subjectivity and experience might happen where you're sort of so inundated with otherness that you do engage in this sort of like retreat. And the question is, do you move from a living option to a dead option, right? Or, the existentialists, they talk about an authenticity of owning the condition under which one is free. And then all of a sudden the burden of one's freedom becomes so much that you again retreat into a sort of inauthenticity, and you let other people make the decision for you rather than you freely endorsing that dead option, right? So how to conceptualize this, I'm not too sure, but even just conceptualizing how I just said, right, we do need to do something. And this is not necessarily, I don't know if this is the place to talk about it, but the religious significance of that, right, comes up with climate change is an example where the categories of the problem of evil, right, start to blur. There is both the natural evil that we can't control, but there's also the moral evil of our actions that we do control. And so if there's a Venn diagram, right, between natural evil being one circle and moral evil being another, moral evil is where agents can contribute to it, and then there's things beyond, right? So it's probably in a mixture of those both. And so how will religion take shape? I believe in this new Ridley Scott show on HBO that they somehow deified the sun, right? Like the suns give birth. I don't know. It was something completely different. It was like sun worship, it seemed. I only seen the first episode, so no spoilers, please. In the comment section below. But yeah, but understanding the existential condition under which different subjects navigate meaning making in the world. So religion can be a form of poetics. Religion can be a form of way of life and the arrangement of habits that one goes through. So when certain people die, for instance, right, ritual just takes over. And we invented those rituals to take over when we are incapacitated by the sudden pain and grief and loss that we feel, right? And so we go through the motions, but those things are there for us. So when a parent dies, for instance, and you're an only child and you're being helped by maybe your dad's brother with funeral arrangements, that a lot of people take on some things and you're just like in shock walking around. You do still manage to put a suit on and things, but the Catholic rituals take over, right? And they give a certain space of routine to where we are incapable of making decisions. So there are some things that religions do help us. They help us cope with that, right? And there's I don't necessarily know if they're a clinical way. I'm not a psychologist. I can't really say but the existential burdens of when we undergo those experiences, right? Certain habits form. And at that point, when we start to see subjects as relational in relation to a whole, and that parts of experience are what we might call relata, that our exchanges with the universe will always persist in that gap, right? And so if we go back to the handout real briefly, right, you'll see the thesis. Scroll up to the very top, if you could, please. Thank you, Kelly. So when we go to here, right, a little bit more. So this is the thesis, right? I will say that William James did not write this very logically, right? Because the thesis of the whole article is given in section 4. And then he the next few sections, and then something like 13, he starts arguing for this. Maybe it's 10 or 11, but you have to rearrange the reading a little bit, or at least draw your students' attention when you teach the will to believe in a classroom. But he says, our passional nature not only lawfully may, but must decide an option between propositions. Whenever it's a genuine option that cannot be by its nature decided on intellectual grounds, for to say under such circumstances, do not decide but leave the question open, is itself a passional decision, just like deciding yes or no, and is attended with the same risk of losing truth, right? And he also italicized this. Those italics are not mine. But when we see the word passional nature attached here, right? Or I use the word affective dwelling in another talk I gave, right? The affective dimension is an onto-relational, it's an onto-relational concept in James. Persons fold in relationship to each other, and we have relationships with things that are mind independently real that we can't do anything about. But within faith and values, we can construct the social world. It's a little bit more malleable. And I think that people might also resist James if they press them, that he lets in the social into what should be an epistemic, should just, and if I were thinking like someone who's skeptical of James's approach, if they do think that he's a subjectivist about belief, they don't understand the actual ontological scaffolding that pure experience and his commitments about how experience functions, right? It's like coming in to critique Heidegger and saying like, why are you keep talking about things that are ready to hand, right? And then completely ignoring this thing called being in the world, right? You can't actually start critiquing Heidegger without understanding Sine-Intervelt, right? Yeah, being in the world, that's the way it is. And this idea that experience is functioning in a very specific ontological way, as spelled out by radical empiricism, I think is here even in the worst constructions of the will to believe argument, because you have to acknowledge that the truth of X can neither be proved nor disproved. Why is that the case? Well, it's because we've tried, and we've had 24 centuries of metaphysical theses that have been on the table, right? And none of them have borne out to be true. And the reason you can't do this anymore with 2,400 years of metaphysics behind you is you never had the ability to verify any particular philosophical system anyway, even though everyone writing in that time thought that they could, right? I really think that Spinoza thought that he had solved something when he invents like God and his attributes, and you start reading, you know, Spinoza's ethics. When you talk to Leibniz, like Leibniz's pre-established harmony, he thought he solved something, right? And so we get to see that the past attempt of different historical theses have never been verified. So, and I think that that backdrop informs the reasons why James articulates the will to believe as he does. I guess that's my big selling point for trying to sort of like reconstruct the will to believe argument. And even during his lifetime, William James basically said, look, I should have really called this the right to believe. And it was never about God's existence per se. It's not about any particular metaphysical system, although developing it in a Christian society, right, is totally that point. So. Anyway.
Good stuff. Thank you very much for sharing all that. You did a lot of food for thought.
Yes.
Two short gifts by way of reciprocity. I don't know if you're familiar with Ishiguro's book, Clara and the Sun. It's a novel by the English
Japanese. Yeah, I've not.
Japanese guy. But when you were talking about the wolves thing, in that particular thing, what they've done is they've created artificial intelligence that has gotten so good at doing the human relationship thing that they're surpassing. And what's interesting, without any spoiler alert, is Clara and the Sun refers to the fact that this android has become so affectively advanced that she actually believes that the Sun is a benevolent person who can work miracles for her, which is in a secular culture. It's an interesting book. And then the other thing that struck me is, are you familiar with C.S. Lewis's brief piece on the obstinacy of faith?
I am not too familiar with C.S. Lewis beyond that one book that every like evangelical student reads, that basically just steals like the 5 ways arguments and then tries to argue how simply they are. I forget what it's called. What's the
some people, C.S. Lewis is not to some people's taste. What's interesting about the obstinacy of faith is it's the flip side of the will to believe, and the argument is, how does one have the right to hang on to a belief when the evidence starts stacking up against it? It's a very brief, quick read. You might take a look. It might be kind of fun for you because you're so into this. And I am too. So I really appreciate your sharing. But I just something's worth taking a look at. So,
I mean, you know, yeah. I mean, the naturalist, I think, has I think there are many reasons one should be a naturalist about the world. And last night I was at a cafe and I was reading Michael Leidenhog's, he's got a new book out with SUNY Press called Naturalizing God. And he starts to articulate he has basically a way of conceptualizing all the different forms of religious naturalism that are of people who are alive. And so, And every once in a while, pragmatism like bubbles up and then disappears again.
Yeah.
So, you know, so I mean, how to account for the sacred and the valuable. Also, the fact that, you know, these are forms of life for people, right? And you have to live alongside people who are religious. It's just, you know, I think the thing about James, and maybe the last point to make before, you know, ending this, is that within James, even though James does, I think, fairly, he's fairly individualist, and if you want a pragmatist ethics, you need both James and Dewey to work together before like individualism and more collective social pressures, right? But there is a proto commitment to community and democracy, even in James's pragmatism, because there is a point, right? And it's as amorphous as Mill's harm principle, right? But there is a point where an idea, whether religious, metaphysical, or otherwise, can engender costs that are harmful and that would implicate our ability of experiencing possibility. We see this in the moral philosopher and moral life, where he says that, like, you know, we should do things to satisfy most people. But I've always read that commitment to satisfy most people, but also not to harm them, right? So I think that, you know, even though it's not present and it's not explicit, I think there is a commitment to the social well-being of others, and an attentive awareness for the pragmatic test of ideas for what they might engender. So you know, you think about, you know, white Christianity's complicitness with slavery in the United States. And then, you know, you watch and you read newspapers about how like some Missouri Synod convention meeting of the Baptists can't decide on like notions of racial justice in a post George Floyd world, right? Where these things are now in people's faces, but they choose to ignore them, or like, you know, it's like a split vote. And you're like, do you guys really like this guy named JC, right? Who's walking around Bethlehem, and, you know, and he seems to be like engaged in actualizing unconditional love for complete strangers, to the point where like you should be for racial justice, right? But notice the pragmatic upshot of only paying attention to individual salvation in these religious movements, right? They focus on the individual, not the social, right? But if the social field is the place where this effective becoming is at its heart, then you need a theology both for the imminent suffering of the conditions around you as well as the future. But because a lot of evangelical Christians are dispensationalists, they want the rapture, they have the apocalypticism, they pay attention to some future state of affairs at the expense of what's imminently around them. So the social gospel and things like King do not look Christian at all when you think that the implications of Christ would also have a social, political, and economic understanding of what the world should be looking like, right? So they pay attention to individual salvation and an individual relationship as to isolate the possibility of certain questions not being asked in those denominations. And they still might do that. It's, you know, so there are certain ways that we can also take James's pragmatism to evaluate the possibility as to how certain possibilities are currently concretely being lived out. And avoiding the future, or avoiding the existential imminence right now in certain denominational possibilities of Christianity, lend itself to providing the impetus or for engendering what I call the aesthetics of fascism, or the aesthetics of authoritarianism, right? So you see certain religious types co-opting certain religious forms of understanding to do really bad things in the world, and not necessarily thinking that you're doing bad things, as you become blinded, but you keep focusing only on the individual salvation. So you abuse this Augustinian rediscovery of a personal relationship with God at the expense of the social field in which that actual relationship should have concrete consequences for you. But you just keep focusing on the individual, right? And you ignore the social. So
well, I could talk about this all day, and I've got to run. It is interesting. What you need to do is, we'll see, Eileen. is do another talk and do it on the varieties, because I'm thinking, as you say, he starts out front in there basically saying, we're not going to study the social piece of this. We're going to focus on the variety of individual experiences. But then where he does end up is he just says, I don't know if it's the last chapters, but saintliness is where he goes at the end. And if the suggestion is that, and again, you talked about this new category of individual that really is a seeker of sorts, that really is a radical empiricist that has kind of given up on the idea of certainty and is widely open to all of this otherness that you're talking about.
Right.
That does see it sort of bear itself out in charity. But he doesn't really talk about it much because he sort of has decided up front to elect to simply focus on the individual piece. It would have been interesting if he had written something a little bit more about the social piece.
I've actually thought, I mean, I know that we have to go. I've actually thought about like the one form of religious expression that James is very mean against is Catholicism, because like a collective ritual in the Varieties is just seen as like not being like a proto-individual experience. Like it's all somehow molded, in Heideggerian terms, it's like inauthenticity. And so it's not the same as these individuals having experience. And I'm just thinking like, I've never met when I meet Jesuits, right? When I meet Jesuit priests, they're not really as orthodox as you might.
Not even close.
Not even close. And so I'm thinking to myself, like, there's a paper to write where like you can defend what James wants and get that out of Catholicism, and that he was unfair to it. I mean, yeah. So I'm thinking that might be something down the road. But you're right. The place of the social in terms of theorizing experience, the centrality of lived experience, its dimensions, right? Like epistemic experience is a very small time slice of experience. And I'm not disregarding that it's important, because I think idealizations of epistemic experience are oftentimes what the good work that epistemology is doing in my colleagues. But the fixation of it as the ontologically primitively basic form of experience that all matters of lived experience are judged by, I think that's an important feature of Husserl's critique of the natural attitude. But even more than that, that would be my critique of.
It's going to be a real hard habit to break. But I totally agree with you.
Yeah, if we right. I mean, that's an institutional habit of how people are trained to write analytic philosophy, right? Like if S knows P under conditions X, Y, Z, then S will phi, will act in such a way, right? I mean, like, so all the philosophy of action stuff is written in this regard too. So anyway, I've
got to run. Thank you
so
much for your time. It's been great. Good luck finishing the book. That's wonderful stuff. But I've got to run. I've made a promise to somebody to have something done by 3:00. So I need to go.
Well, I thank you for your time, sir, and thank you for being a wonderful conversational partner.
Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me, Kelly. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you for showing up. And again, this has been great conversation.
Enjoyed it immensely. Thanks. Bye-bye.
And I agree with Frank that you do need to give another presentation. And I think it should be with us again.
Well,